There is a specific type of person who puts on a pair of noise-canceling headphones, locks the bedroom door, and paces the exact same worn-out track into the carpet for 2 hours. Not the I space out during boring meetings type of person. Not the I have an active imagination type. Someone who has an entire alternate timeline running parallel to their actual life, complete with complex lore, recurring characters, and emotional stakes that feel just as real as a racing heartbeat. You know exactly what this is. You are staring out the backseat window of a car, watching the power lines dip and rise, while mentally delivering the most devastating, perfectly timed monologue to someone who hurt you 4 years ago. Perfect delivery. Absolute emotional triumph. And then the car hits a pothole. The physical world snaps back, and you realize your hands are physically shaking from the adrenaline of a conversation that never actually happened. If any part of that made your stomach drop, good, because there is a completely unseen psychological phenomenon operating inside your mind right now, and nobody talks about the actual mechanics of it. Not the standard childhood daydreaming thing. That is not what this is. This is something that starts as a fleeting escape and eventually becomes the primary residence of your consciousness. And the reason you have never brought it up to a therapist or a friend is because you intuitively know how crazy it sounds out loud. But from the inside, it does not feel crazy at all. It feels like breathing. To understand why your brain does this, we have to rewind. Because you didn't just wake up one day and decide to replace reality. You can probably trace this back to the early 2000s, sitting in the back of a 1998 Honda Civic, staring at the rain on the window while your parents argued in the front seat. Or maybe it was late at night, bathed in the blue, static hum of a Windows XP desktop, downloading tracks on LimeWire. You would listen to the same song on loop because it was the exact soundtrack required for the cinematic universe in your head. You probably still have a highly specific, carefully curated playlist right now that you cannot listen to around other people. Because if track 3 plays, you are immediately gone. Back then, a movie ticket was $8.50. But the theater in your mind was free, totally under your control, and infinitely safer than the hallways of your middle school. So what is actually happening in your nervous system when the music plays and your eyes glaze over? In neuroscience, there is something called the default mode network. This is the neural superhighway that activates when your brain is idling, when you stop focusing on an external task and retreat into your own thoughts. It is doing exactly what evolution taught it to do. It processes memories, simulates future threats, and helps you figure out your place in the social hierarchy. But in your brain, this network did not just occasionally activate, it became the dominant operating system. The brain effectively learns that running internal simulations is neurologically safer and more chemically rewarding than dealing with the friction of the outside world. Professor Eli Sommer, a clinical psychologist, first formally identified this exact behavioral pattern in 2002. He gave it a name: maladaptive daydreaming. It is a clunky, deeply clinical term that hardly captures the bittersweet beauty of the worlds you have built, but it is the anchor we have. And what Sommer's research revealed was staggering. He found that for a specific subset of the population, this was not a harmless hobby. People were spending hours, sometimes the vast majority of their waking lives, fully submerged in these internal narratives. 60%. That is the amount of their waking hours some of his subjects spent entirely disconnected from the physical room they were standing in. And the underlying thread connecting all of them was not a desire to write fantasy novels. It was a deficit in their reality. The daydream provided something that their actual life was fundamentally starving them of. It was not lazy escapism. It was an emotional supply chain. It gave them the illusion of control in unpredictable homes, or a sense of deep, unconditional intimacy when they were chronically, silently lonely. You can construct a perfectly safe romantic partner in your head. You can rewind a confrontation until you win. You can finally receive the exact apology you never got at age 14, perfectly tailored to soothe your specific nervous system. It is brilliant. The problem, and there is a devastating one, is the phantom pause. Eventually, your brain starts to calculate the return on investment. It learns that real life requires immense friction. Real people are messy, they misunderstand you. They take days to text back, and true intimacy requires a terrifying amount of vulnerability. The daydream requires zero friction. The daydream never abandons you. So, your brain simply chooses the path of least resistance, and the real world begins to feel remarkably thin, gray, and aggressively exhausting by comparison. You start rushing through your actual life, canceling plans, hurrying home just so you can be alone in your room and finally get back to the real story. It is not a symptom of low intelligence, either. In fact, the research points to a psychological trait called dissociative absorption. This is the dial in your brain that controls how deeply you can immerse yourself in an experience. People with high absorption are the ones who feel the physical bass of a symphony in their chest, or the ones who stare at a painting until they lose track of time. You just took that massive cognitive horsepower and pointed it entirely inward. You feel everything so violently deeply, so you constructed a soundproof room in your mind where you could experience those feelings without the risk of being perceived. And then comes the shame spiral. This is the heaviest part, the part you never say out loud. When you finally snap out of it, when the music stops or you catch your reflection in the mirror after pacing for an hour, the physical reality crashes back down on you. You realize you are 28 or 35. You realize it is dark outside. You look around an empty room and a very specific, suffocating wave of grief washes over you. It is the realization that the best, most profound moments of your life, the moments where you felt the most loved, the most heroic, the most understood, did not actually happen. They belong to ghosts, and that realization carries an emotional hangover that is so incredibly painful. The only way to soothe it is to immediately put the headphones back on and go back in. The shame creates the pain, the daydream numbs the pain, and the loop tightens. If you are watching this, you probably think this makes you defective. You probably think you have wasted a massive percentage of your life on a delusion. But that is fundamentally untrue, and the psychology does not view it that way. This habit was not a flaw in your character. It was a highly sophisticated survival mechanism. At some point in your life, you were trapped in an environment that was too chaotic, too lonely, or too emotionally barren for your sensitive nervous system to handle. You needed an exit door. The real world did not provide one, so you built one from scratch, entirely out of thin air. You became your own emotional regulator. The daydream was not the sickness. The daydream was the medicine. The question you have to answer today is simply whether the medicine has become a poison. Most people who recognize themselves in this immediately panic. They try to go cold turkey. They try to aggressively lock the door to their inner world, out of sheer self-hatred, aiming to never daydream again. That does not work. And honestly, it is a tragedy to even try. The goal of your psychological development should not be to murder your imagination. The goal is to decode it. Look closely at the worlds you keep disappearing into. What is happening in them? What is the fantasy version of you receiving that the real you is completely denying yourself? If your daydreams are entirely about being rescued and comforted, What boundaries are you failing to set in reality? If your daydreams are all about achieving massive fame and being recognized by an adoring crowd, where in your daily life do you feel invisible? The scenarios you are rehearsing are not random. They are a map. They are a highly detailed, neon-lit blueprint of your unmet psychological needs. You have an incredible, genuinely rare capacity for emotional richness. You can hold entire universes of empathy and narrative coherence inside your head. The tragedy is not that you have this gift. The tragedy is that, somewhere along the way, the world convinced you that your depth was a burden, and that it was only safe to express it when no one else was watching. So if you made it to the end of this video, and you are sitting there with a very specific, heavy knot in your chest, not the "that was an interesting psych fact" feeling, but the kind of quiet recognition that forces you to take a slow breath, I just want to remind you that you are not crazy, and you do not need to be fixed. You survived a world that felt fundamentally unsafe by building a better one. You adapted quietly and privately, in a way nobody ever saw or gave you credit for. If someone sent you this video, it is because they finally found the words for a secret they have been carrying since childhood. And they trust you enough to let you see it. If this resonated with you, consider subscribing and turning on notifications so we can keep figuring this out together. I genuinely appreciate your time. See you in the next one.